Aerial war games are a family of games which I am especially keen on, especially if those games include a dedicated set of solo rules. So if a game is both an aerial game and it has a solo mode, you may count on me that I will present it on my channel. And today I will tell you a few words about one of them. Hello everyone, this is Michel Leviathan Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. As I said a few moments ago, aerial war games are games which are almost always things that bring my attention, that are something that I am extremely keen on, and I always enjoy discovering new aerial war games. One of such games was a game published in 2018 by Dan Verssen Games called Down in Flames Locked On. This is a game which I have already presented on my channel, both during a Polish and an English review of the standard rules, as well as during a playthrough of the solo mode in Polish. Today the review of the dedicated solo mode in English, because this is a game which not only allows you to play in a group of 2 to 6 players, but also it allows you to play it solo. So this is an aerial war game which focuses not on a specific conflict, because most aerial war games focused on a specific conflict. For instance, we have a lot of games covering battles fought during World War II, World War I, or maybe, for instance, the war in Vietnam. But games which allow you to recreate aerial dogfights fought in different conflicts and during different epochs are quite rare. And Down in Flames Locked On is one of such games, because in this game you get a bunch of airplane cards which vary from planes flying during the final stages of World War II, up to even planes flying during the early 21st century. And it's up to you to choose what type of dogfight you will be fighting. Of course, you can choose historical dogfights which occurred, for instance, during Operation Desert Storm or during the Yom Kippur War. But you can also fight, for instance, fraternal combat between French and German forces somewhere in the 1970s. Or you can choose to, for instance, recreate a dogfight between Argentinian and Israeli fighters. Why not? It's up to you. So this game, as I said earlier, is a game for 1 to 6 players, and today I will be focusing strictly on the solitaire mode. If you want to see how this game works in the standard way, go check my previous review concerning this mode. The time of play of the solo mode will be pretty much the same as when you played the game in the standard way, so it will be somewhere around 30 minutes. Today I'd like to present you how the solo mode works, and at the end of the review I'd like to give you my final thoughts and my final recommendation, and I'd like to tell you if you are searching for an aerial war game which works well solo, this might be a good choice. So the answer will be at the end of this video. Without further delay, let's check how Down in Flames Locked On works. Down in Flames Locked On can be played solitaire in one of two ways. Firstly, you can play a classical dogfight just as you do when using the player rules, the standard set of rules. But you can also grab a campaign sheet and play also a whole campaign. So this is a good thing, because the game is
possible to be played just the same as it is in the standard mode. You do not have to keep anything aside. You can just grab a campaign and you can play through all the scenarios, playing as one of the sides, determining victory and the outcome of the campaign at the game's end. So that's a good thing, because in some solo games there are some things which are left apart in solo modes. Here it's not the case. So when you prepare the game, you do it quite just the same way as you do when you play a standard game. So you can pick up your airplane, you can pick up your opponent's airplane. You should do it, of course, in such a way so that both sides are quite balanced. So you have many options to do so. You can firstly look at the victory points value of the machines, and you can randomly choose 2 of them. You can also, for instance, decide to choose from planes which are from 40 to 50 points or from 40 to 60 points, and then, in order to obtain a better balance, give additional special capacities to the weaker planes, because as I already explained during the review of the standard mode, we do have special abilities which can be attached to planes. Each of them has a certain value which indicates how powerful such a capacity is. You can also take a look at the date when a plane entered service, and you can, for instance, grab 2 planes which entered service at pretty much the same moment, because thanks to it they will be quite balanced and the game will be quite entertaining. So after preparing this, after choosing those 2 planes, you can start playing. And again, a nice surprise is that, in contrast to many games, in order to play this game solo, we do receive a dedicated solitaire rulebook, because in many games we have just 1 paragraph or 1 page telling you what you should do when playing a game solo. Here you have a dedicated set of rules, as you can see, with a lot of additional tables. And hopefully and thankfully to DVG, we have those tables also on a dedicated solitaire chart. As you can see, this is the chart which is used strictly for solitaire play. It is printed on it, locked on solitaire charts, and you have everything that you need to play the game inside on this chart. So you should keep it somewhere near the playing area in order to see what elements will be used, because we do receive a lot of tables. You will get a lot of dice rolling. Yes, dice rolling, which means that in this mode you will be using a die. It is a 10-sided die which you should grab from another game, because unfortunately we do not receive a die in this game. So if this is your first war game, it is highly possible that you do not have any 10-sided dice in your collection. In your house, you'll have to buy one, or you'll have to randomly determine results using, for instance, your phone or your computer, or maybe you can create some cheats in order to obtain results from 1 to 10. But if you have other war games, I'm sure you have other war games, you can just grab a 10-sided die from one of your other games. So preparing the game is pretty much the same as in a standard play. The sole difference is that you will randomly determine the starting altitude of your opponent, and you will also draw a certain number of cards which will constitute your solitaire opponent's hand. As in the standard set of rules, you will draw a number of cards equal to the performance of the card which you are fighting against. But in contrast to standard play, you will not be looking at the content of those cards. You will not be choosing from those cards in accordance to some tables or in accordance to some specific rules. You will just be keeping. You will just be controlling the number of cards. So it's the number of cards in your opponent's hand which will be important, because when we look at the mechanics which are governing the solitaire play of Locked On, you can see that most of those mechanics will be related to the number of cards which your opponent has in their hand. So firstly, you will discard and draw cards. You will draw cards up to the opponent's maximum. Then you will randomly determine if your opponent changes altitude. He can dive, he can climb, or he can maintain his current altitude. Then you will make some adjustments which are related to the speed of the opposing aircraft. If the opponent's aircraft has a higher speed than yours, then your opponent can make a number of 3 adjustments. Finally, we pass on to the play actions phase, during which it's the number of cards which will influence the opponent's actions. Now, during the action phase of your opponent, we should firstly determine if the solitaire aircraft is in any of its weapons envelopes, which means that our own aircraft is in range of one of the opposing aircraft's weapons. And here we have 2 possibilities. The first one is that the opposing aircraft is too far, too high, or maybe it is in a bad position in order to launch an attack. So an attack is impossible to be launched due to one of those reasons. If this is the case, the opposing aircraft will be trying to improve his position, his range, or to improve his altitude in order to bring one of his weapons into range, so to allow him to make an attack. And he will of course be using the cards that he has in his hand. So in order to determine what type of adjustments your virtual opponent will be doing, we will roll a die. We will add to the obtained result a number equal to the number of cards held by your opponent. So if, for instance, he has 6 cards in his hand, we will add 6 to the die result. For instance, 4 plus 6 will give us a final 10 result. And we will find the corresponding result in the corresponding table play cards, which tells us how many adjustments your opponent will be doing. And here, for instance, he will do just 1 adjustment, which means that your opponent will try to improve his range, improve his altitude, improve his position. So he will be trying to improve his position, to bring his plane into such a position in which he will be able to use his weapons. After adjusting such a position, we discard one of the cards which are held in the opponent's hand, and we pass to the next action when we again verify if he is able to launch an attack. Of course, like in the standard mode, if our opponent tries to adjust position or range, we can respond to it. So using our own cards which we have in our hand, here nothing changes. We are looking for cards which will be responses to our opponent's actions. So for instance, here we would be answering to maneuvering. So playing a break would potentially stop such a change of position or of range. But as in the standard game, we enter here into an action-reaction cycle, and we will be using a different table in order to determine if our opponent responds to our own response. In order to do it, we will again roll a die, and we will add to it the number of cards held by the opponent in his hand, and we will check if the final result is 9 or higher. If it is, it means that our opponent will be responding to our own response. So once again, we will roll a die, and we will verify what kind of response our opponent plays. So for instance, if we played a break, we will be searching for the break card. Here we have the break column indicating what type of response our opponent plays. So for instance, if we obtain a 7 or an 8, our opponent will play a scissors card. So in fact, we do not look at the opponent's cards. We just assume that he has the card indicated. We discard one of the cards held by our opponent, and the cycle goes back to us when we can once again respond, this time to the card played. So for instance, to a scissors card, and so on. So when we respond, our opponent can respond. So if we play, for instance, a barrel roll, our opponent will try to respond to a barrel roll, etc. The same applies to moments when our opponent launches launches a missile or it tries to attack us with guns. This happens when he has our aircraft in his range and he is at a position which allows him to launch an attack. In such a situation, we will use a different table which is related either to missiles or to gun attacks. Again, we will roll a die, we will check what type of missile our opponent launches. If he does, because it is also possible to end the play of cards, if launching such a missile is impossible due to the number of cards held by our opponent and the die roll obtained. And if he launches a missile, we can respond to it in the same way as we do when playing two-player games. Our opponent, if he has any countermeasures on his plane, he can also use them, because if our opponent fails to respond to a tone or a missile card played by us, we can always and we should discard the countermeasure counter from the opposing aircraft in order to stop our attack. So this mode, in pretty much with this soul chart, enables us to keep most of the elements which are part of the standard game, which is always nice, because playing this mode, we do not have the feeling that the game is very much different from playing a standard game against a human opponent. So those are pretty it, all the basic rules governing the play using the solo mode for Down in Flames Locked On. Now let me invite you to a brief conclusion. I'd like to share with you my final thoughts concerning this mode. I'd like to tell you what I think about it and what in my opinion are its strong but also the weaker points.
Down in Flames Locked On is a game which I tried to play a few times. I played it instantly after opening the box some 2 years ago, as I suppose, and my first impressions weren't very good. It was a pretty much flat experience. But during the time, each time I tried to play the game, I discovered something interesting in it. I discovered in it something new, and at the end, now when I am preparing this video, I must say and I must admit that the way that I rate this game, the way that I judge this game, evolved from a flat experience to a game which I really enjoy, which I really like. And I'd like to share with you the reasons why. Firstly, when looking for strong points of this solo mode, because I won't be repeating what I think are the strong points of Down in Flames as a whole game designed for 2 to 6 players, I will be focusing only on the solo mode, is in my opinion the fact that we do receive a dedicated set of solo rules. And this might be something funny to hear, but we have nowadays a lot of games which are released with the information that they are also solitaire suitable. They have a solo mode. But in fact, when you take a closer look at many of those games, those solo modes are very, very easy and are very general. You receive, for instance, half a page of additional information about how to solo this game. Or you receive, for instance, some recommendations how to approach certain situations, or how to interpret some rules so that you can play the game solo. In Down in Flames Locked On, it's not the case. You have a dedicated rulebook which is focused strictly on the solitaire mode. You have a dedicated player aid on which you have all the tables which you need to play. Additionally, this game is designed in such a way that the solo mode is a game which has all the things that you had in the basic game. And this is an extremely good thing, because in many solo games or in many games with a solo mode, some things which are part of the core game are left apart in the solo mode. Here it's not the case. So you have everything that you had in the base game. You can use each airplane that you have in the box. You can use each action card that you have in the box. You can use each capacity that you have in the box. You can use every rule, even the optional rules that you receive at the back of the standard rules. you can play the campaign mode. So everything that you could have used in the basic game is here, and this is always a good thing because you do not have to worry about how to interpret some things, how to interpret some rules. You play the game from the human perspective just as you did when facing a human opponent, and this is extremely good. And this was achieved thanks to a very clever idea, because the last thing that I would like to see in this game would be a huge appendix with the list of all the action cards telling you how to interpret those cards in the solo mode, when you should play them, in which order you should play them, how to react to specific cards with what you have in your AI's hand. Fortunately, the designers and the DVG team decided to take another path, and it was an extremely clever approach. I like this approach in which it's not what you have in your opponent's hand which matters, it's the number of cards. And this is an extremely streamlined approach, but I like it a lot. It works extremely well. We cannot forget that Down in Flames Locked On is a quick game. It's a game which is meant to be fast, it's meant to be dynamic, and at its core it's a cycle of action-reaction. And preserving all that in the solo mode enables you to have the same playing experience while you play this game with a human opponent. So using this system in which you just count the number of cards that your AI opponent has, and using this number of cards as a die roll modifier is an extremely good idea. I love it. I think it's intelligent. I think it's in the spirit of the game, and it works extremely fine. Thirdly, what I like in this solo mode is the fact that those solo rules aren't very complicated. You do not have some complicated algorithms. You do not have a set of exceptions. It's very simple. But at the same time, I'd say that even though using a lot of die rolls, it's still quite elegant. You know how to play the turn of your AIs, you know how he will respond during your turn, because you do have all those information on the player aid, and you have those tables, you have those die rolls, it's all well explained. Playing this mode, I had absolutely no doubt how to interpret the rules. Lastly, what I really enjoy in the solo mode is the fact that here I'd say it's something quite interesting, because from the human perspective the game is just as you played it in the standard mode, including also the randomness concerning the cards that you draw. So sometimes you will get bad draws, and sometimes, for instance, you will have no tone cards or no cards to react to your opponent's actions. It still happens. But what's interesting that from the AI's perspective, the fact that you are not verifying the type of cards that your opponent is holding, but only the number of cards, the lag factor is reduced from his perspective. So your artificial intelligence opponent will be more often efficient in his place than you are, which in my opinion is an interesting thing, because when facing a human opponent, both of you can have bad card draws. Your artificial intelligence opponent will never have bad card draws, because he will only draw a number of cards, and if he responds will depend on the die roll. So of course randomness is still here, and it will depend on the die roll outcome. But you will not have this feeling that your opponent is not responding to an obvious thing. So for instance, if you play a break card and your opponent has a lot of cards in his hand, he will always play a response. Because for instance, having 8 cards in his hand and playing a break from your perspective will always trigger a respawn, because searching for a respawn requires you to roll a die. You'll obtain at least a 1, added to the number of cards gives you a 9, and responding to a break is automatic. You always have a response. So this is somewhat strange that you have this feeling that the lag is is smaller than in standard games. It's not something which is extremely different. It's a different perspective, and in my opinion, it's a good thing. I liked it because I do not like games with artificial intelligence opponents who are making stupid errors or very bizarre decisions. Here, those rules governing card plays are still quite smart. You won't be having very bizarre situations in which your opponent is holding, for instance, a monster hand of 8 cards and he won't be doing anything. Or there won't be, or very rarely you will encounter situations in which you will play a card, and for instance a missile card, your opponent is holding 8 cards and he won't be doing anything. He'll always react with something because the probability that he would be holding something valuable, something which he could use while being a human opponent, is very high. So this is well balanced. I think it's well designed. I think it's smart. I think it's in the spirit of the game because it is still very dynamic and very fast. So what I think are the weaker points of Down in Flames Locked On? The first one is pretty obvious. It's really a small thing, but I'd like to again repeat that I think that the game should have included a 10-sided die. Because imagine a situation in which this is your first war game. You do not have any other game in which you have a 10-sided die, and you do not receive it in this box. You have to buy a die, or you have to use other ways to determine all those very often die rolls in this game. I think the game really wouldn't be different if DVG decided to add a die to the box. It would still be the same game, but you would have a better customer experience because it's a small thing, but sometimes it really might be a problem. The second thing is that I said that this game has a really good set of solitaire rules, but I think that there's still an issue concerning how the AI works, because I said that this game has an intelligent AI. It will not be making stupid moves. But even so, I think there is one blank spot which a human player can use in order to outsmart his opponent or to gain a small edge. This concerns reducing range, because the rules say that your virtual opponent will always do one of two things during his turn. He will check if he can attack us with one of his weapons, which enable him to shoot at us at the given range and his current position. If he has this opportunity, he will fire at us. But if he doesn't, he will try to close range or change his position in order to bring one of his weapons in the distance and in the range that allows in the position and in the distance that allows him to use this weapon. So in this situation, he will play cards in order to change position, in order to change range. And at the game's start, both planes will almost always be out of range, which means that your opponent, if starting the game, will be automatically trying to close the range. But by doing so, he will be using cards from his hand. And waiting for your opponent to change your range without wasting your own cards is, in my opinion, a very obvious strategy which you will be very often using. I used it a lot, and in most times it gave me a small edge during my plays, because my most common tactic was to wait for my opponent to close the range by using his own cards, not always drawing enough cards to replenish his hand, waiting for his first attack with a huge bunch of defense cards, and then launching a strong attack when his cards in his hand were at a low limit. So this is in my opinion, very efficient strategy, not a winning strategy at all time, because I played several games in which I was shot down due to the fact that my opponent closed the range and immediately launched a rocket, launched a missile which I couldn't stop. It happened a lot. But even so, I think that this gives the human player a really small edge, which is, in my opinion, a way of exploiting the AI's algorithm. So if I were to say search any things in this algorithm which might leave a small blank spot, that would be it. Even so, I think this algorithm is really interesting. It's still dynamic, it's in the spirit of the game, which I have already said a few times. So this is not a big issue, but I think that, in my opinion, maybe is something which makes you use a very repetitive strategy during each game. Of course, due to the fact that you have such a great palette of airplanes with such a great number of different missiles, with the number of special capacities, with all the campaigns, you will still have a very different experience during each play. So this is not a thing which really makes this game a weaker design. I said during the start of this conclusion that my opinion about Down in Flames Locked On evolved, and if I were to shot this review a few years back, I'd say that the game is okay, but if you're searching for solo aerial war games, you should search for something else. But then each time I started playing this game, and I had 3 or 4 such approaches, I enjoyed this game more. And today, when making this review, I must admit that I really like this game. I like it because it is so dynamic, it enables you to create so different dogfights with so different aircraft, with different skills. It's quite immersive, and today I'd say that this is a very valuable element of my collection, because I like aerial war games, I like solo games, and sometimes when I'm looking for something very quick and entertaining, Down in Flames Locked On will be my first choice. So to my surprise, I must say that this game went from a title which I was quite skeptical, which left me with some flat experiences, to a game which I really enjoy. This shows also how sometimes a game can show its real potential after several plays, and sometimes also after putting it for some time onto your shelf and trying it in a different moment, with a different mood, with a different approach. I think it's also a lesson for me, but maybe for some of you also who are watching this video, that games sometimes show how they really play only after taking a look at them from a different perspective. I will remember this lesson because as a game reviewer, I always try to give you a better insight and better info about all the games that I present on my channel. Concluding, Down in Flames Locked On is a good game with an interesting solo mode which preserves all the elements which are also part of the standard game. If you're searching for an interesting, quick and dynamic aerial war game which enables you to recreate dogfights from different conflicts fought during the second part of the 20th century, this is a very interesting choice. This was the review of Down in Flames Locked On, published by Dan Verssen Games. Thank you a lot for watching this review. I invite you to take also a look at our other movies. We have other reviews and unboxings in English on our channel. Take also a look at our Instagram and Facebook accounts. If you want to support Wojennik TV, take a look at the description of this movie where you can find the link to the Patronite account, because you can become one of our patrons. I wish you a terrific day and see you next time.